Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and one of my own games. This is a bit of an odd one in some ways. It's not necessarily going to be the most exciting bit of gameplay, but on the other hand it's also going to be very optimal gameplay for this particular ship, the Cleveland. Now it's a bit of an odd one in some ways because this could even be better. It is a game with a carrier, so I'm going to get to use the Cleveland AA, but there's a couple of peculiarities. For one thing, you might notice I'm running Hydro. That's because this is the setup I use when I'm playing the Cleveland in operations, and the defensive AA for some operations is less desirable than having a Hydro at certain points, but I simply forgot to change it back for this random game, so I'm going to have to be relying purely on my AA. However, it is an AA spec captain and an AA spec Cleveland. I'm actually going to flash up on screen right now the captain skills I'm using, and you'll get to see the long range DPS there as well. So that's with flags, it's the maximum possible range, it's the trifecta of manual AA, AFT and BFT, and so therefore I'm giving up some things here. I'm giving up Concealment Expert, I'm giving up IFHE, I also don't have Demo Expert, so I'm just relying on the natural abilities of the Cleveland without any enhancements aside from the AA. So, okay, this could be better. You know, with IFHE I could have a better damage setup, with Concealment Expert I could have a stealthier setup. But this is Estuary, and this is one of the best maps for this particular ship. This and the Atlanta, and really any HE spamming cruiser that has sufficiently high arcs to make use of the various islands, because the islands on Estuary are for the most part low enough that you can fire over them, especially in stuff like an Atlanta or a Cleveland. So there is going to be some AA, power in this one, just purely the manual AA doing its work, and the enemy carrier will figure out at some point that I don't actually have a defensive AA, but I'm still going to shoot down a fair few planes even so, just through the power of manual AA. So if nothing else, you'll get to see the value of that skill. And although the Cleveland is undoubtedly the king of AA at this tier, I should maybe throw in a little note at this point to say, well, it's actually not the only ship with very strong AA at tier 6. The Queen Elizabeth is arguably nearly as good. The main thing that sets the Cleveland apart from the Queen Elizabeth is that it can mount a defensive, except I'm not mounting that defensive at the moment, so I'm really only a little better off than my AA spec Queen Elizabeth, which only has about, what, 10, 13, something like that, less DPS on those long range guns. It has the same range. You can get it out to 7.2 kilometers, so it's almost as good, it just doesn't have a defensive. I should also note that the Bayern is almost as good in terms of the DPS as the Cleveland and the QE. I think that's actually maybe slightly better than the QE. It's something like 110 you can get it up to on the outer DPS. But crucially, the range isn't as good. It's got a smaller outer envelope, which does make a bit of a difference. It's still pretty good, but it's not quite as powerful as having that massive 7.2 kilometer range, which makes it really very effective. But the majority of this game, I'm going to be doing this. This is all that this gameplay is going to be about, is me sitting behind an island and pelting lots of HE at things. And as I say, in some ways this is peak Cleveland. Now, if I had IFHE and Demo Expert, I possibly could be doing even more damage than I am. But I'm still going to do a fair bit in this one, and I'm actually going to exert more map control than you would think I would be able to just by this one technique on this map. But it's not going to be just me, there are other allies on this side of the map as well. But the enemy team demonstrated an unwillingness to push in at certain points, as we shall see later on, which will cost them dearly because it means that I'm just going to get to completely abuse these islands and sit here and just go pew pew pew. Now I'm starting to move a bit at this point. I don't want to be stationary on the off chance that the torp bombers come for me, but they're going for the Bayern instead. However, the dive bombers are coming for me, and I think it's roundabout now that the enemy ranger possibly realises that I don't have a defensive AA. But even so, with control clicking on the planes, I'm still putting out over 200 DPS on his tier 7 planes. So yeah, it's not nothing. It's definitely not nothing. And although I probably could have had more plane kills with the defensive, I could have just completely wiped some of these squads very quickly indeed. I think the absolute number of plane kills wouldn't have been that much higher, because the enemy carrier was not sending their planes near me that often, but maybe more often than they would have otherwise if I did have a defensive. So there was about a minute of awkward manoeuvring there, and I was debating whether to redeploy to the other side or to stick on this side, and then I decided, actually no, we're going to stick around. They do still have one destroyer left, but it's mainly you know, bigger, more visible ships at this point. So I'm going to redeploy a bit, but I'm going to basically put myself in a position where I can use a different island, because there are multiple islands on this side that I can make use of. And it is then going to put me in a position of relying on the carrier or other ships to do the spotting for me. But the carrier, the allied carrier, was actually somewhat paying attention. They were making use of my AA. I did, at the start, you know, I typed a message in the chat saying, you know, bring planes over near me if you can. And if you're a decent carrier player, you'll be trying to do that anyway, of course. And the enemy carrier player, you know, you have to be pretty bad not to know that a Cleveland has good AA by the time you get to tier 7. You will surely have noticed by that point. But yeah, even so, they were at times maybe being a bit incautious, and perhaps it's because I didn't have a defensive AA. Maybe they figured it was a bit safer to come near my AA bubble, but as it is, I've already got 16 plane kills, and I've not done that much. So the remaining destroyer, the Gallant, basically makes a run on our Ranger and is spotting our Ranger for his allies, and it looked a little bit dicey, but as it is, I've managed to get the kill on him with our Ranger still having enough health to make a getaway. So they get to run away and be alive. We've taken out the remaining enemy destroyer, and so what's left is a couple of ships to the south. They do still have the sea cap, but there's quite a lot of ships clustered up in the D cap, and they're not pushing, crucially. There's 3 enemy battleships there, and they're all just kind of sitting there firing at things at range. And so, although we are down on points at the moment through having lost more ships, this is the wrong thing for the enemy team to be doing. This is playing right into my hands. If you're on this map in this situation where there is some jerk like me sitting behind an island in an Atlanta or a Cleveland or a Boudionni or a Galissoniere or any of these things, just sitting out there in the open in a battleship is not the right thing to do at all. And I do have some support that's going to stop them just immediately pushing into me, but they have enough numbers there that they could try and overwhelm us. It's me and 2 battleships, and they've got, what, 3 battleships and a cruiser, so they do have the numbers advantage, but they're not using that numbers advantage. They're playing very conservatively, very cautiously, and it's the wrong thing to do at this particular moment in time. So I can absolutely just sit here, abuse these firing arcs, and try and rack up more damage, get more fires going. Although I am getting some shatters here, because I think I'm managing to hit turrets when I'm trying to get superstructure, but it's a little bit hard to account for the movement when someone is dead face onto you like that. You are going to get some turret hits regardless of how well you're aiming. Well, unless you get very, very lucky, of course. So I'm concentrating on the Bion because it's the lower health ship, but it would almost maybe help out our carrier more if I was shooting at the Texas right now. In retrospect, maybe I could have. And especially now that I've set another fire on the Bion, probably the better thing to do would have been to go for the Texas. And it's not going to necessarily hurt the Texas that much, given how much health they are on at the moment. But it's more significantly going to knock out the Texas's AA mounts, because that thing relies on its mid-range AA. It's got lots and lots of AA. It's by far the most powerful AA ship at tier 5, and in fact it might even be arguably the best AA ship, the best AA battleship at tier 5 or tier 6. Although you could argue the toss on that one. You know, I've already talked about the Queen Elizabeth and the Bion both having very buffable AA. But yeah, the Texas, just in terms of the sheer DPS it can put out, it's still very powerful. But you start knocking out those mid-range mounts and suddenly that DPS starts to plummet, so that's really going to help out our carrier if I do that. So the carrier's taken out the Bayern, so now I am firing at the Texas. There's also a fighter that's wandered into my AA bubble, and I do have them selected. I was trying to be quite diligent in selecting planes for manual AA, and so you know, they're just using the fighter to scout a bit, but it's costing them planes to do it. And I'm pretty sure they were trying to find our ranger, but instead all they found is my AA bubble. And at this point he actually brings his planes back in, maybe to go for my float plane fighter, I'm not sure. It does have the side effect, of course, of it's lighting me up. And it's not really what I want. You know, I'm taking my very first damage. We're over halfway into the game and I'm just only now taking damage because I've just been absolutely abusing the heck out of using these islands. But I've shot down that entire squad now. That's an entire squad of fighters that Rangers just lost that they really couldn't afford to. So yeah, it was a little bit inconvenient, but it was only ever inconvenient. It wasn't really going to be a serious problem for me. I do, however, need somebody to spot this Texas before I can start firing again. So if the Estuary would go forward, if our Ranger would spot them, that would be basically quite nice. And it looks like these enemy ships actually are now putting their focus back towards our teammates who are pressing over from the west. But this is still, like, it's comfortable for me on this flank. It's been comfortable all along, basically. But this is still quite a close game, both points-wise and in terms of numbers of ships. Although we are now starting to get that advantage. It's starting to show a bit that that our tactical situation is better than the enemy teams. And so it's not definitely won yet, but we're getting there slowly but surely. And in terms of getting there, I'm also getting there. 92k damage and counting. It's not bad. I'm sure I've had better Cleveland results. Although having said that, maybe I haven't. Maybe this will be my best damage Cleveland result. But there certainly will be people out there who have had better damage Cleveland results. Probably with IFHE and Demo Expert, just to maximise that damage output. And that's the thing with the Cleveland as it is at the moment. And I'm sure it'll be the same when it's tier 8. You'll have the choice of those two profiles, if you like, where you can either go for AA power, or you can go for damage. And even when you go for that AA power, it still is a capable damage dealer, and the same will be true vice versa. You know, you go for the damage output with the captain skills and it's still going to be a decent AA ship. It's just a very, very good ship, and I suspect it will still be a very, very good ship at tier 8. But as it is at tier 6, playing it sometimes it can feel almost a little bit unfair. It is one of the strongest tier 6 cruisers, there's no doubt about it. So this Texas is trying to make a getaway, and again I'm just selecting planes. I think the enemy range is running low on torpedo bombers at this point. In fact, that might be their very last torpedo bomber, but they do still seem to have some dive bombers available, so I've preferentially selected them. They took out our Pensacola, our very low health Pensacola, who's actually going to have the second most plane kills on the team. So I think that Pensacola must have had a defensive, which is not an unsensible thing to do. But even without defensive, I'm still going to end up with the most plane kills, I'll tell you that right now. Although it's not going to be too many more than I've got at this point. It certainly, as I said earlier, it certainly could have been more. I could have wiped out squads a lot quicker, but on the other hand, then, as I said, the Ranger might have been a lot more cautious about bringing planes near me than they were. So, in a way, it kind of worked for me, but it still wasn't optimal considering this is supposed to be an AA spec to Cleveland. So I'm pushing forwards just to keep these guys in range. It's probably the first time I've really pushed out of cover. And you can tell when you've completely ticked somebody off, because he's now, even though he's got that Cesare starting to turn broadside, he's picking on me. And that's because I've just been pelting it with HE for so long, and you've got to get annoyed at that point. I've been in that position in a battleship. I completely empathise. I literally, like the folder where I saved this, I literally called it "Cleveland is a jerk." normally it's like, you know, Cleveland X amount of damage, or, you know, Cleveland Kraken, or, you know, some descriptive things that I know which replay folder or which replay is which in each folder. But yeah, this one was just called Cleveland is a Jerk, because it was just peak Cleveland being a jerk and using islands. So the enemy Cleveland pops out and actually manages to kill our Estuary, so that's not welcome, but I kill him, and that's put us basically within reach of the finish line. So we've got 3 ships left, the enemy team has 4. We're both over 900 points. This was a close game all the way along, and if there was more time I might even consider going after one of those battleships, but fighting battleships over open water, even with the amount of health I've got at this point, is probably not the wisest proposition. So yeah, but as it is, it doesn't really matter. We're about to win on points, although not before I get just a few more plane kills. So there it is, 124,000 damage, 28 plane kills without defensive AA, 13 fires, nearly 300 hits, and it was basically peak Cleveland, more or less. You know, it was a bit of an oddity in some regards. It wasn't quite optimal, but considering that I wasn't particularly set up for doing huge amounts of damage, it was still a pretty decent result. So 2.1k base XP there, top of the team. The Pensacola was actually second place, and maybe a little surprisingly, it was more main battery damage than fire damage, but it was still a fairly significant chunk of fire damage, 52k. So that's not nothing. That's definitely not nothing. You might have noticed also I've got the perma camo on this, so I think that gives me like a slight reduction to the running cost, but it doesn't give me any bonus to the actual the income. The reason I bought the perma camo for the Cleveland was it's 1,000 doubloons. Tier 8 perma camo is what, 3,000? So seemed a bit of a no-brainer. You know, once this becomes a tier 8, I'll have gotten a tier 8 perma camo for 1,000 doubloons basically, and whatever replaces the Cleveland at tier 6, I'll have a perma camo on that as well. So yeah, that one seemed like a fairly decent investment, but for the most part I don't tend to buy the perma camos unless it's some reason like that. So there it is, the Cleveland is indeed a jerk, and I'm sure it will continue to be a jerk at tier 8. But of course you don't always get to play it that way. That was a fairly optimal situation in quite a lot of ways. So hopefully you enjoyed this replay, and if you did, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.